Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this English Catholic History Association talk. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start with. I'd be grateful if you could all mute yourselves from here on. We'll have the talk shortly. I'm sure you're familiar with Zoom by now, and you know if you want to ask a question or make a comment, we have the chat function. So please put your questions or comments in chat. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd also just like to say that, as is usual for our talks, we've invited members from other Catholic history societies that we know of around the country. So if you are from one of those other Catholic history societies, you're very welcome. You might like to make yourself known in the chat. Just say, hello, I'm from the Midlands or the Essex Recusants or the North or Northeast Catholic History Society. It'd be nice to know that you're here. In addition, for this talk in particular, we were so inspired by our speaker's choice of title, Faith of Our Mothers, that we've invited members of Catholic women's associations that we're aware of. So if you are here from the National Board of Catholic Women, or the Association of Catholic Women, the Catholic Women's League, the Union of Catholic Mothers, or simply Catholic Mothers, or any other similar group, we'd love to hear from you and love to know that you're here. Please say hello in the chat, and you're all very welcome. So it's now my pleasure. I'm Nigel Parker, one of the trustees of the English Catholic History Association. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Tim Guile, who is in fact the chairman of the English Catholic History Association.
Can you hear it, Tora?
Please mute yourselves. Thank you.
Shall I mute all? I hope I'm not going to mute you, Nigel. But
How do you?
Okay, I'll carry on. So yes, Tim joined the English Catholic History Association a few years ago and became our chairman in the relatively recently. Amongst other accomplishments, he has revolutionized our presence on social media by setting up a Facebook group, which in less than a year has attracted no less than 3,600 people, not just in England, but around the world. We also have a Twitter account, and I've put the Twitter account handle in the chat. So please do follow us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. So Tim is a history teacher. He's also a writer. He's a graduate of Liverpool and Warwick Universities, and he's written articles for publications such as the Midlands Catholic History Society, Anglo-Catholic History Society, the Fellowship and Fairy Dust publications, and the Essex Recusant's journal called Southeast Catholic History, amongst others. So we're delighted to have him to speak to us tonight, and he's going to speak to us on Faith of Our Mothers, Catholic Recusant Women in England, 1558 to 1610. So Tim, we're looking forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours. But you're on mute at the moment. Tim, you're still on mute. You may need to press mute in the top of yours.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's
brilliant.
Better,
well done. Welcome to the CHA talk this evening, and especially to any women who are here as well, because this is dedicated to Catholic women at the period of time that we're going to be talking about. So the title is Faith of Our Mothers, Catholic Recusant Women in England, 1558 to 1610. This talk is a study of some of the aspects of the role of English Catholic women under Elizabeth I and James I. It assesses how the Catholic faith was passed on in troubled times. It looks at examples of Catholic families where the women had a role in resisting the imposition of the established church, and how they managed to access the sacraments and continue devotions in secret. Women used their homes and servants to pass on the faith and support to the recusant English Catholic community as well. In fact, the use of a recusant woman's home as a haven for fellow recusants and itinerant priests was the main method of preserving Catholicism in England during this period. So that's basically the theme of the talk this evening. This talk is dedicated to those women as well, those brave women who fought so hard to maintain their faith in those times. Women such as Margaret Clitherow of York and the women of the Throckmorton family of Coton Court are a few examples. It's a story of personal bravery, hardship, and dogged determination in the face of punitive laws and regulations imposed by the male-dominated society which they found themselves. Catholic women therefore had a central role in keeping alive a smouldering ember of the old faith in the dark night of persecution, in the hope that one day it would burst back into flame once more. Women suffered substantially for their recusancy, and Elizabeth's government was not reluctant to jail them. Women, married or otherwise, were imprisoned throughout the reign of Elizabeth I and James I. In 1581, Parliament passed a new law against Catholics. Recusants, those who refused to attend church, had to pay a fine, and those who tried to encourage people to become Catholics could even be accused of the very serious crime of treason. The penalty for treason was death. A law of 1581 made it difficult for the courts to collect fines and incurred by recusant women, at least until the deaths of their husbands, as men were assumed to have responsibility in law for family finances. This fact did not make these women immune to imprisonment, though. Several women, during the period after the passing of the statute, served time in prison. This article is dedicated to their memory. Oops. Some historians might argue that the role of women in early modern history is not fully recognized, and that the role of Catholic women in this period does not, at first reading of the historical sources, appear to be central. The evidence, however, about the role they played in the time of the Reformation and its immediate aftermath tells a different story. The role of Catholic female resistance to the harsh and punitive anti-Catholic laws in England need to be told. There were bitter disputes brought about by the Reformation in England, and Catholic recusancy became part of this identity, with its tales of martyrs for the faith. It's a story which, at its heart, is the meeting point between gender relations and religious identity formation and confessional conflict. So, 40 Martyrs of England and Wales, which we remember, include various. There we are. Various different women, and we're going to talk about some of those this evening. So, here's a quote from Elizabeth I. There is only one Christ Jesus, one faith, all else is a dispute over trifles. Unfortunately, there were a bit more than trifles at this time. And so this is a quote from James I, whose wife, Anne of Denmark, was a Catholic. Well, wife, if you cannot live without this sort of thing, do your best to keep things as quiet as possible, for if you don't, our crown is in danger. And interestingly, at the time of James I, a Catholic priest, Father Abercrombie, was tolerated at court, provided he was disguised, though, and not noticed as a priest. So, just one second, I've just lost my place a bit there. Okay, so 40 Martyrs of England and Wales. In 1970, when they were actually created, only 2 were women. 95% of them were men, and of these, most of them were priests. Some of the Catholic holy women that we remember at this time: St. Margaret Clitherow, Anne Lyne, St. Margaret Ward, and Blessed Margaret Pole. There's just some examples of some of the women of this time that we should try and remember. So here's a quote from Professor John Bossy in his book, The English Catholic Community. He says, on few points in the early history of English Catholicism is there such a unanimous convergence of evidence as on the importance of the part played in it by women, and specifically by wives. So basically what he's saying is that women were very, very important at this period of time and often not given the recognition that they should do. And that's an interesting sort of point, really, that we should remember. The diocesan returns of 1603 show that more women than men were officially named as Catholics. The total of all the dioceses in England and Wales were 4,593 women, 2,986 men. The figures show that 60% of the known Catholics were women. That's from Brian McGee's The English Recusants. It says that. And some of the old gentry and noble families, especially in the north of England, were opposed to having Protestant monarchs once again. Catherine Neville was a known recusant, and she's one of the examples of the Catholic ladies we could celebrate. And at that time, Catherine was a known recusant and sister of Charles Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland. And it could arguably be one such woman who helped to instigate and encourage rebellions and plotting. She is said to have spent time in prison for recusancy at Sheriff Hutton in the North Riding of Yorkshire from 1582 to 84 under the watch of the Earl of Huntingdon, who was entrusted by Elizabeth to see that she did not escape and cause more trouble. Interestingly, in her will, she left substantial bequests as well to other known recusants, such as her son-in-law, Henry Constable, and her niece. So in the Catholic tradition, the family is a bedrock of the faith, and the duty of parents is to pass on that faith. This gave the mothers in the early modern period a unique role within the family and within the Catholic community. There's both a devotional and a spiritual role, as well as having a community dimension. Historical evidence appears to indicate that Catholic women and girls who adhered to the Catholic faith in the post-Reformation period were able to cope with religious turmoil and develop methods that enabled them to function successfully in preserving certain elements of their faith within their own environment. As Catholic practices were removed from the public sphere of the Reformation and gradually became more of a dissent and more of a dissent underground faith, Catholic women applied their skills and, together with laymen, became effective agents of the by now clandestine faith. Within the recusant movement, a key role of women was in establishing and maintaining the networks which ensured the continued practice of the Catholic faith in a covert manner. Recusant women used their homes to harbour conservative Catholic priests, but moreover used their noble status to establish and maintain recusant networks through marriage and familial connections. Their links to various members of the aristocracy, gentry, and government administration were instrumental in their survival during the period of gradual restrictions on Catholic practices. One such woman was Catherine Neville, later Lady Constable and sister of Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland. So women played a substantial role in the recusant movement. Catherine was a known recusant during her whole life, and she helped to instigate and encourage a lot of trouble for the government at that time. It could be argued that women have, throughout the ages, been upholders of Catholic family life, serving primarily as mothers and wives. Women of different ranks and levels of society were generally instructed and expected to become devoted mothers and to rear and raise their children in a Catholic family. However, a Catholic woman's role in 16th century society could be much more complicated than that. The English 16th century society was a patriarchal one in which men, by law, had superior power, influence, and control over women, both married and unmarried. Queens such as Mary I and her half-sister Elizabeth both wielded power as monarch, but the advisors, ministers, privy council, MPs, lords, and bishops surrounding her were, of course, all males. Catholics who would not conform to the rules laid down by the state and Anglican establishment and attend Church of England services after a time became known as recusants. Some refused to conform to the state's legislation and instead recused themselves from the government-imposed beliefs, worship, and practice. Laws were passed from the 1530s onwards, restricting how Catholics could worship and practice their faith. A brief respite from royal disapproval came during the reign of Queen Mary, when the Catholic Church once again held its position in the nation as the predominant church. Queen Mary was able to roll back the liturgical changes brought about during the reign of Edward. During Edward's reign, there had been the greatest confiscation of church property in the history of the country. Every parish was left with only the bare necessities for simple worship, while the state enjoyed the proceeds. The church at this time was at such a low ebb, which was slowly remedied during Mary's reign. All the evidence suggests the numerical importance of Catholic women and extent of the female contribution to the Catholic cause depends upon a wider examination of the conditions with which they lived and the strategies employed by the whole community. The Act of Uniformity of 1558 commanded Elizabeth's subjects shall diligently and faithfully have no lawful or reasonable excuse to be absent, endeavour themselves to resort to their parish church or chapel accustomed for common prayer and such service of God, but every Sunday and other days ordained and used to be kept as holy days, and then there to be abide orderly and soberly. Upon pain, so offending shall forfeit church censures, and every person so offending shall forfeit for every such offence 12 pence, to be levied by the church wardens. This act is important in the discussion of recusancy because it sets the tone for any future interaction between recusants and Elizabeth's government. The Act of Uniformity did not allow recusants to use any legal arguments or excuse for avoiding church attendance. The Act also made it clear that there was no reason to be absent from service or to be disorderly during the service. Catholics were effectively constrained from the start. The idea of attendance in body but not in mind created a problem for Catholic families, and the Act's attendance requirements and the temptation to disturb the church service through any means was covered by this Act. Disruptive actions were punishable under the law by a fine of at least 12 pence per week or more. Financial penalty initially became the primary policy when the government pressured Catholics to conform. Recusant men and women found it difficult to formulate a strategy to deal with the new religious settlement. Many must have been torn between serving God and their conscience and the responsibility to abide by the law, as now required by the Protestant-dominated Parliament under threat of fines. The reign of Queen Elizabeth brought harsh and punitive laws against Catholics. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1559, she set herself against the Pope by declaring herself supreme governor of the English Church in matters spiritual and temporal, and denouncing loyalty to the Bishop of Rome as an act of treason. Henceforth, all Christians in the realm were required to follow the state religion or suffer the consequences. Catholicism and treason were seen by some in the Privy Council as synonymous. Under the early guidance of Secretary of State Sir William Cecil, Parliament repealed Mary's pro-Catholic legislation, established a permanent Protestant Church of England, and encouraged the Calvinist reformers in Scotland. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, reigning on high, which effectively excommunicated Elizabeth I, who had of course been baptized as a Catholic, deprived her of the right to rule, and released her subjects from obedience to her. This had the unfortunate effect of antagonizing Elizabeth and confirming her opinion of the church she had joined as a baby. It also led to suspicion of and bad feeling about Catholics within the kingdom. Over the years of Elizabeth's reign, things gradually got worse and worse for Catholic subjects. New laws associated with Catholicism, with sedition and treason against the crown were enacted. Recusancy was the legal term for refusal to attending church at that time. The first law in which the term popish recusants was used was 1593 and was called an Act for Restraining Popish Recusants to some certain place of abode. This Act of Parliament went on to describe Catholics as sundry wicked and seditious persons who, terming themselves Catholics and being indeed spies and intelligencers, not only for Her Majesty's foreign enemies, but also for rebellious and traitorous subjects, born within Her Highness's realms and dominions, and hiding their most detestable and devilish purposes under a false pretext of religion and conscience, do secretly wander and shift from place to place within this realm to corrupt and seduce Her Majesty's subjects and to stir in them sedition and rebellion. There was no grey areas with this legislation. It was plain and simple. Catholicism was an alien and dangerous canker which had to be cut out of the body politic. No further justification was needed to excuse how Catholics should be treated. The state's definition of a recusant is a person convicted for not repairing to some church, chapel, or usual place of common prayer to hear divine service. So you can see that Catholics were not exactly very popular with the government. After following the passing of the first Recusancy Act, families of known Catholics were now under suspicion. What prompted this act and the actions which followed were mainly political. So here's a definition again that I read out of the Catholics under the Act and what it entailed. The Crown and Parliament were concerned with loyalty to the Crown and with fear of foreign threats from Catholic Spain. The Medieval Treason Act was used to seek out and hunt down potential enemies of the state. During Elizabeth's reign, hiding a priest could incur imprisonment. The death penalty was imposed for merely being a foreign trained priest, as this was considered to amount to high treason, as this was often associated in the minds of the Privy Council and the Queen's ministers as agents of a foreign power, notably Spain. Despite the majority of recusants remaining apart from rebellions and plots, the government and the Protestant majority viewed Catholicism as innately disloyal to the Crown. Following legislation by Parliament, Catholics could officially no longer be buried in Anglican churchyards. The practice of recusant gentry was still interred in family vaults and commemorated by memorials in parish churches. Similarly, Catholics might sometimes undergo an Anglican wedding to provide confirmation of legitimacy. Anglican sacraments might help to provide a veneer of conformity and respectability, which might help them retain legal rights to land and property. Occasional conformity to the Church of England was practiced by some Catholics, particularly the male heads of families, as this was seen as a means of sheltering and shielding themselves and their wives and families from fines, sequestration, and imprisonment. The term church papist was used to describe those who outwardly conformed to Anglicanism, but who were secretly convinced Roman Catholics. Robert Persons, a Jesuit priest and polemicist, in a brief discourse containing certain reasons why Catholics refused to go to a church, stated that non-absentee Catholics who decided to at least outwardly conform were in fact to be seen as schismatics. Catholic recusant wives, widows and daughters were something of a mystery for local authorities because their recusancy was not regulated by law in the same way as for men. There were several reasons for this. During the Tudor period, husbands controlled their wives' property and were responsible for their actions. In practice, however, women enjoyed a greater interest in their marital property than the law that the law gave women, both during marriage and as a widow. Unmarried women's responsibilities were also not clear-cut in practice. Unmarried women and widows who had reached their majority were deemed to be responsible for their own actions and therefore punishable for any actions which were contrary to common law. Access to wives' property could only occur at their husband's death when a will was proved. The government could, depending on the case, tentatively seize 2/3 of their combined assets at his death because of her recusancy, if they should so wish to do. By mutually supporting one another, English Catholic men and women ensured two very important outcomes. First, they assisted in the development of a network that allowed missionary priests to move throughout the country in the decades after 1570. Second, no Catholic community, urban, rural, gentry, aristocratic man or women, were left totally isolated from other Catholic communities or from continental Catholics or religious orders. The circulation of literature, devotional items, and news was possible because of recurrent connections among English Catholics, especially through trade with the continent, through ports and via gentry safe houses up and down the country. This should not, however, be overemphasized. The network was not always consistent or extensive, but in the crisis of tightening controls by the state, it was generally enough for their immediate faith needs. The term church papist referred to Catholics who attended some or all services in the Church of England, as required by the state, but secretly considered themselves to be Catholics. People were allowed to keep their conscience to themselves. Some married couples came to arrangements such as the children would be brought up as Catholics except the firstborn son, who had to be, at least publicly, an Anglican, to preserve property and land and inheritance rights. People often played a double game to satisfy the state and abide by the law and statutes of Parliament. Church papists were often treated differently from those who refused to attend any church services at all. However, the lines were often blurred between recusant and church papist and shifted continually and varied within households and changed over time. Although church wardens were meant to keep lists of householders who did not regularly attend church services or attended but refused communion, for whatever reason, this was not always consistent. Recusant wives, widows and daughters were something of a mystery though, and the law often didn't know what to do with them. Men were responsible for them until they came to were responsible for them most of the time, whether they were unmarried or married. So how did the law treat the women? Access to wives' property could only occur at the husband's death, when the will was executed. The government could though seize some of their property and land after the death of the husband. Under Elizabethan law, women's rights were assumed by the father or legal male guardian. Spinsters and widows were given the category of competent age and thus were deemed to be responsible for their own actions and punishable under the law. Girls under the age of their majority were the responsibility of their father or ward. These lack of rights and thus of property meant that it was very difficult for the authorities to impose a fine on a married woman unless her husband paid the fine. This was clearly a challenge to the Privy Council, who relied on local justices of the peace and sheriffs to implement the law. So there's an interesting quote at the time from Antonio Fraser about holy women at the time that she's writing about. Women were regarded as having perceived weakness, and this was actually their strength, because although some people thought of them as weak and feeble, they were in fact actually very strong, and they were actually able to take advantage of this. So recusant women were ordered not to proselytize or to influence children. One example of this female recusancy was Margaret Throckmorton of the famous Catholic recusant family of Warwickshire in the 1570s. Marshall reminds us, in his book in 2018, reminds us that recusancy by wives of wealthy landowners was not uncommon, as wives in theory owned no property of their own and consequently were hard to actually find. So it's a very mixed picture of what was actually going on at this time. J.C.H. Aveling, writing in the Catholic Recusancy in York, says it was accepted by the authorities that a large proportion of the York recusants were the wives of Protestant tradesmen and husbands. For women without property at the bottom of the social scale, the authorities had to be content with public humiliation, such as placing them in the stocks, which every community had at that time. The imposition of the laws against Catholics varied from place to place depending on who was in charge or the social status of the Catholic in question. One can see how local vendettas could be settled by denouncing your enemy as a papist and then sitting back to watch the results. Some women were sent to prison for going to church. In 1595, Archbishop Hutton of York acknowledged that most of the Catholics in his archdiocese were women. It was accepted by the authorities that a large proportion of York recusants were the wives of Protestant tradesmen. There were some brave ladies in Yorkshire who, when faced with a choice between twice weekly Protestant sermons in their house or face jail, chose to go to prison. Some women were confined to an alderman's house, which was a form of house arrest. In 1610, the Commons and Lords narrowly passed the Act for the Administration of the Oath of Allegiance and Reformation of Married Women Recusants. Government actions against husbands, wives, and widows and spinster recusants increased immediately after this legislation. Dorothy Wiseman of Yorkshire married Roger Lawson, a barrister, who at least publicly was an Anglican. Of her 15 children, one became a Jesuit, one a Benedictine monk, one a Benedictine nun, and 4 into the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She was said to have won people over to Rome by her sweet nature and kindness. Even her husband converted to the Catholic faith on his deathbed, as his career no longer required conformity. From the government's point of view, there could be no way to estimate the number of Catholics, both conforming or recusant, as people had kept their secrets. And there's a picture there, or pictures there of York, the shambles on the left, and York Castle on the right, as it was a long time ago. All recusants were Catholics, but not all Catholics were recusants, such as church papists. It was a confusing and muddled picture, more of a spectrum than a binary choice. Church of England bishops estimated the number of recusants at 8,500 when James came to the throne in 1605. However, this was a vague estimate and in no way of accurately knowing the true figures. Questier and Lake have examined the more famous example of Margaret Clitherow in the context of divided communities and martyrdom. In 1970, she and the other English martyrs of the troubled period were canonized by Pope Paul VI on October 25th, the day designated their collective feast day. Margaret, brought up as a Protestant in York, converted to Roman Catholicism in 1574. She was imprisoned 3 times for her faith and died as a martyr on March 25th, 1586. Margaret was born at Middleton, York in 1556. Her father, a local businessman, was at one time sheriff of the city and a church warden of St. Martin's in Coney Street. Brought up in the state church, she married John Clitherow, a widowed butcher with 2 children, when she was still a teenager. By the early 1570s, she decided to convert to Catholicism, possibly under the influence of Dr. Thomas Vavasour, a well-known Catholic sympathizer in the city. This created a problem for her husband, as it was his job to report Catholics who were known to prefer the old faith to the state-imposed Church of England. But for this offence, she was imprisoned in York Castle. After release, she still refused to attend divine service in the parish church, and twice more she was imprisoned, the 3rd time for a period of 20 months. This deprivation of her liberty only seemed to make Margaret even more determined to follow her conscience and refused to go to the local Anglican church. One good aspect of her incarceration was that she said to have learned to read and write in prison. Between 1582 and the following year, 5 priests were executed at the gibbet at Knavesmire nearby for continuing their ministry under the noses of the authority. Margaret was said to have made visits to the place of execution under cover of darkness to pray for the souls and to ask that she too could be a martyr of the faith. So there were many people in York and in Yorkshire generally who were actually harbouring priests and practicing their faith. And Thwing was one of them, in York, and Mrs. Stapleton as well, and various other people, Bridget Maskew and Tessa, and so forth. Some of them were hanged as well for the charge of treason. So York particularly was a hotbed of Catholicism at that period of time. Margaret herself was instrumental in hiding priests, either at her own house or elsewhere in the city. She had a trapdoor fitted in the attic of her house, which led to the attic of the next house. Her husband must have known exactly what was going on, but chose to keep quiet. However, in March 1586, the authorities pounced on the family. A teenage Portuguese boy who was staying with them was threatened with terrible punishment unless he cooperated with them. And when they raided the house, they found this Portuguese boy. They, aged about 10, they stripped him naked and threatened to beat him with rods until he told them all he knew. He was terrified and they spilt the beans and told them what happened. Margaret was indicted and tried at the Guildhall in York. Margaret refused to plead either guilty or not guilty, possibly so she could avoid a trial by jury. She might have got off lightly for this refusal, but for this refusal. She was known to be stubborn and headstrong. She faced her accusers and did not appear to be frightened of the consequences. Here's a picture of her, what she may possibly have looked like, and some more information about her there.
Jim, this is what you look like.
So she married John Clitherow, but she continued her faith, her Catholic faith. Whilst awaiting sentence in York Castle, she sent her stockings and shoes to her daughter, bidding her walk in her footsteps. And when she went to her death, she went barefoot. She wasn't frightened of what was going to happen. And here is something that she's supposed to have said when she was faced with the court and with the fate that they said that she would have. The church is one that wherein the true word of God is preached, which Christ left to his apostles, which the same church hath always observed. The doctors preached, the martyrs and confessors witnessed. This is the church I believe to be true. The reason why she didn't plead guilty or not guilty was to save other people, to save her children, and to save other people who might be implicated in what had happened. So she was an incredibly brave person. On the 25th of March, 1586, Margaret was led barefoot from the castle to the city toll house on Ouse Bridge. The officials who were delegated to execute her could not be persuaded to carry out the sentence of death. After all, she was the daughter and daughter-in-law of prominent citizens in the town. Instead, they found some beggars who were persuaded to carry it out. They stripped her naked, laid her on her back, spread-eagled on the floor, and with a sharp stone under her back. And then her arms spread out like a crucifix. A wooden door was placed on top of her and heavy weights were added. It took 15 minutes for her to die. Her last words were reported to be, "Jesu, Jesu." Here's a picture from the time or soon after, what it possibly may have been like. One can only imagine what effect this had on her family. Her husband was sent away from the town at the time of her execution, so he wouldn't be there. Her daughter Anne Clitherow ran away from home and was imprisoned at Lancaster on account of her religion in 1593. She later became a nun of St. Ursula's in Louvain in 1598. Henry Clitherow studied at the English College at Reims in Rome and temporarily joined the Capuchins in 1592, then the Dominicans. William, her stepson, became a seminary priest in 1608, and the other stepson, Thomas, a draper, was imprisoned for recusancy and died in Hull prison in 1604. Their family had their fair share of suffering for the faith. Another example of suffering for her faith was Anne Tesh, or Tesh, depending on how it's written, different places, who was also imprisoned in York in 1583, around the same time as Margaret Clitherow. Her reason for refusing to attend church was, "For there is neither priest, altar, nor sacrament there." Her husband conformed, but she steadfastly refused. She was released at some point after that because she was arrested again on March the 10th, 1584, after attending a mass at Margaret's home in the Shambles, York. She later spent many years imprisoned in York Castle before finally being released when James I came to the throne. Women's recusancy could be divided broadly into two groups, devotional and personal piety. Oh, here's a picture of Margaret's hand as well. This is in the Bar Convent in York. If you're interested to go and see that, it's her actual hand. The rest of her is buried elsewhere. Nobody's quite sure where. So two groups, devotional or personal piety and communal activities. The latter drew most attention from the authorities. Acts of individual Catholic piety in the home, whilst against the law, did not necessarily affect outsiders, but could result in the potential conversion of children or a spouse. Aveling argues that the gentry's households could be divided into two types. The first were those run by either widows or recusant wives or conforming husbands. The second were the crucial and far more numerous ordinary households, of which there were roughly 100. Out of the total of about 300 households, roughly 20 were characterized as priest residences. These homes served as operational bases for at least two priests to work a circuit of the surrounding area. The reasoning for having a priest in pairs was so they could hear each other's confessions. Normally, these homes were temporary because of the potential for raids. Women administered some of their households, but the largest group of 300 were termed matriarchal households, where the ruling influence of the home was feminine. These tended to be small recusant cells with the matriarch, children, and a few other close female relatives or friends. These women were encouraged to imitate the large Catholic houses, which were nearly monastic regularity of prayer and devotion. Mass attendance was said to be both a devotional and a communal activity. First, whilst attending Mass, women interacted with other recusants, fugitive priests, and potentially continental Catholics. Individuals would exchange information, devotional literature, sacramentals, goods, money at this time. Second, attending Mass distinctly separated recusants from the conforming Anglicans in a community and effectively helped them to to a devotional foundation for the continued Catholic community. While these women worked to help fellow recusants, the devotional life they stimulated gave the communal life of their home and local community a Catholic nature. The primary means for inspiring local or family devotional life was the Mass. To celebrate Mass, either in a home or in some other secret place, priests had to be smuggled into that place. These women would often bring children, servants, and friends to Mass. The unpredictable nature of when the next Mass was to be held inspired some to risk raids and imprisonment by attendants. It was very high stakes. All of this was achieved under the sustained pressure from recusancy laws to conform. Lady Arundel was a Catholic lady who secretly housed Father John Cornelius at her manor in Chiddock in Dorset. Father Cornelius was seized because of treacherous information by a servant, tortured and executed for treason. Lady Arundel bravely recovered what was left of his body and gave them a Christian burial. These women would often be forced to live secretive and discreet lives due to the fear of repercussions for their beliefs. Furthermore, women at that time, due to their relative anonymity, would be utilized within the recusant movement to carry out unlawful activities such as hosting Jesuit priests and secreting Catholic objects. Due to the domestic setting in which women existed, they had comparatively more freedom than men to engage in such activities without investigation. These recusant women assisted each other and used other resources such as servants and Protestant relatives to maintain links between families and friends in England and on the continent. More importantly, and in narrow terms, they helped to make sure members of their family had some repose from outside pressures to conform. The ties these women created and maintained also exposed them to the authorities. Privy Council investigations concerning the locations of Catholic exiles on the continent, such as Lord Paget and Lord Arundel, included interrogations of women who carried letters or might have knowledge of exiles' whereabouts. The tactics and manoeuvres women developed in the late 1570s became increasingly necessary as government pressures increased. Systematized persecution may not have existed, but government efforts were sufficient to warrant clandestine activities for the sake of the community. The government removed some Catholic children of varying ages from Catholic mothers and fathers to persuade them to recant and become good Protestants. After a debate in Parliament, it became obvious that these powers could also be used against Protestant dissidents as well as Catholics. It was eventually decided the removal of children was an infringement upon the parents' conscience and rights over their children's upbringings. Anne Lyne was a recusant woman and now saint. For 3 years, she was responsible for managing a safe house for Catholic priests. She was arrested and then surprised by constables during Mass at this safe house. On the scaffold, she is reported to have said, "I am sentenced to die for harboring a Catholic priest, and so far I am from repenting for having done so, that I wish with all my soul that where I have entertained one, I could have entertained 1,000. Magdalene Viscountess Montague was another brave Catholic lady who made no secret of her Catholic faith. Her mansion near Battle, Sussex, was sometimes known as Little Rome, on account of the numerous priests who visited her private chapel. She was often seen with rosary beads and a crucifix at a time when those popish baubles were officially frowned upon. Much of her household, in common with most recusant gentry, was said to be Catholic. This, of course, was a way of maintaining security and secrecy in a hostile society. This lady managed to maintain Catholic piety with loyalty to the crown, so that Elizabeth even paid her a visit in 1591. This was not the same for ordinary Catholic subjects, though, and anyone in possession of what was called papish trish-trash could immediately be under suspicion and might have to acknowledge the Queen's supremacy and abhor all popish trifles. Catholic women were treated no more favourably than men at this time. It is recorded that Juliana, wife of William Byrd, a famous composer, who was almost certainly a Catholic, was indicted for recusancy in 1577, yet he was able to maintain his position in court due to adequate public conformity, probably because of his popularity with court circles. Public conformity, even if sporadic and infrequent, was sometimes enough to maintain one's position in Elizabethan society. During Elizabeth's reign, government pressures to conform caused recusant women to take on non-traditional roles, in the practice of Catholicism. Expanded responsibilities in the home developed during the imprisonment of husbands and sons. Often these women were the only links between different communities of recusants or between different recusant families. Rowlands argues that by comparison to Catholic women prior to the Reformation, recusant women were placed in a position of greater spiritual and temporal leadership. These women in England did this with full support of the Catholic Church. Many accepted that the times were difficult and out of the ordinary for Catholic spiritual life. This is not to say the Church desired women to overturn the patriarchal nature of society or the Church, but the situation in England called for individuals to take on stations beyond themselves and to act abnormally. All of this was to be done within the context of obedience to authorities to support the faith. Rather than being the simple-minded, frail women the period describes them as, recusant women proved themselves to be far more quick-witted, organised, and capable of great sacrifice and leadership. John Bossy and Marie Rowlands each believed Catholic women, English women, felt deprived of their pre-Reformation role due to literacy primacy and the loss of a family chaplain. Remaining Catholic in a non-Catholic country developed recusant women's roles rather than shrank them because of the political and family situations caused by government actions against them. It was these communities the authorities wished to penetrate with a network of spies and informers. It must have been a difficult time not knowing who to trust and what you could or could not say to neighbours, tenants, servants, friends, or even relatives. This is a picture of William Cecil there, Lord Burghley, who was certainly an enemy of Catholic priests at the time. By 1590, Elizabeth I's chief advisor, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, had singled out women recusants, and especially high-ranking gentlewomen, as a special problem, and had decided that one of his priorities should be ensuring that these recusant wives be indicted, condemned, and imprisoned. Cecil set out as the main goal of English policy the creation of a united and Protestant nation. The obstinacy of female recusants, especially in the north of England, was a problem he had to resolve. Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, and the President of the Council of the North tried to solve the problem by imprisoning more recusant females as a way of trying to persuade other women not to follow their example. He apparently took his task seriously and in 1592 opened new prisons in which to incarcerate them. He committed 23 gentlewomen, including Margaret Dormer, the wife of Sir Henry Constable of Constable Burton, the wives of Thomas Meatham, William Ingleby, Ralph Babthorpe, Ralph Lawson, Marmaduke Cholmondeley, and Catherine Radcliffe, who was a spinster. These women were apparently not deterred by this, as one priest reported, referring to the old faith. The gents were much fallen off, but of the gentlewomen stood fast to it. However, the persecution of Catholics was not uniformly imposed, as it varied from place to place, but government efforts were sufficient to warrant clandestine activities by women for the sake of the recusant community. Recusant women were sometimes able to act as go-betweens amongst their family members and co-religionists who were either imprisoned or under house arrest. Some harboured itinerant priests and recusants moving through the countryside. Others often sent relief to imprisoned recusants. Money was often collected from sympathetic families and was taken by women to prisoners in jail under the noses of the authorities. Wives were usually able to visit their husbands in jail. After all, it was considered part of a wife's duty to her spouse to discuss legal and household matters. As a result of this, the minimum duration for the wives to remain at most places of imprisonment was 1 month. This system aimed to prevent recusant women from acting as messengers or bringing their men popish trish-trash. As late as January 1588, local authorities were still unsure how to proceed against women who persisted in recusancy, but whose husbands were communicant members of the established church. Some bishops, priests, and magistrates advocated the taking out of bonds against the conformed husbands to ensure his wife would remain at home and not interact with those who were of the popish religion. Of course, at that time, husbands had considerable control over their wives and could beat them if they didn't actually do as they were told. Men were encouraged to control their wives by any means, including beating, in order that they did what they were told. Local magistrates brought charges against women because, according to the Privy Council, wives were examples to their whole family and would cause disorder if they were not detained. Like their male counterparts, the highest ranking or most disruptive recusant women were to be detained until, by their husbands, they may be persuaded or wrought to conformity. Surprisingly, despite their views on dangers of recusant women, the Privy Council was sometimes merciful and with imprisoned recusant women. These recusant women must have assisted each other and used other resources, such as servants and relatives, to maintain links between families and friends to the country and in continental countries where Catholicism was allowed, such as France, Spain, and the Low Countries. Servants and tenants were often carefully chosen from good Catholic families, either locally or elsewhere in the country. Most importantly, the women must have helped to make sure that members of their families had some relief from outside pressures from the authorities to conform. Another example of other brave recusant men and women were the Throckmorton family of Coton Court. The Throckmortons' name appears in records among known Catholic recusants during Elizabeth's reign. Before Sir Francis Throckmorton plunged into violent plotting under King James, his family had made a far different sort of impact on England, one of service to the crown and to the country. Sir George Throckmorton, Sir Francis' grandfather, a strong-minded man who had the courage to disagree with Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell over the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Another possible factor is George Throckmorton's traditional stance was sympathy for the fate of his aunt, Elizabeth. She was the abbess of a house of Poor Clares in Cambridgeshire, which was suppressed under Henry VIII in the 1530s. She was a woman of considerable ability. She exchanged letters with the famous humanist Erasmus. After her nunnery was destroyed, Elizabeth, by now more than 60 years old, went to live at Coton Court, perhaps bringing one or two nuns with her, as they had nowhere else to go. She also helped to feed the local poor, and her name was carved above the Dole Gate set up for the purpose. Her tomb is today found to the left of the altar in the Anglican parish church adjacent to Coton Court. The practice of the Throckmorton family, staunch Catholic faith, went in and out of fashion depending on the Tudor ruler. After Cromwell was executed, religious traditionalists felt a little safer in England. The reign of Edward VI was so difficult that some left the country to live in exile. Mary's reign brought brief respite for Catholics. George Throckmorton's seventh son, Sir John, was active in Parliament and a witness to the Queen's will. During the reign of her successor, Elizabeth I, they fell into a defensive position again, and a priest hole was built at Coton Court, where priests could hide during inspections. The family were known as Catholic sympathisers. The family could afford to pay the fines levied for non-attendance at church, unlike some others who were detained in prison instead. Some of the family conformed to the established state church, for example, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, a skilled courtier. Through the influence and continued example of her mother, Margaret Throckmorton became a non-conforming Catholic in the early 1590s. Her mother, a widow and recusant, maintained links with other Catholics by letter and wrote to her son Francis, who was living abroad, by passing her letters through Lady Arundel, also recusant. A network of literate recusant women wrote or passed on communications both at home and abroad. Immediately, her father, who chose to conform, realizing what was happening, asked the Dean of Gloucester to assist in conforming his daughter in religion away from his wife. Margaret was to be cut off from anyone who was known or suspected to be a recusant. The family and Dean immediately implemented these actions because it became known that Margaret had perverted, that is, converted her children and other family members, just as her mother allegedly had too. Her father was to provide provisions and money for Margaret's care and give her books to assist in her conformity to the state church. Lady Throckmorton, his wife, was similarly dealt with. The case of a mother-daughter conversion attracted attention immediately because of the success they had in converting the family. Despite her father being a member of the Anglican Church, Margaret and her mother soon proceeded to convert others in the household. The bravery and determination of these women was admirable. The Throckmorton family later narrowly avoided implication in the Gunpowder Plot. In 1605, a servant to Robert Catesby, son of Sir William Catesby and Anne Throckmorton, a key conspirator in the Gunpowder Plot, and the son of Anne Throckmorton, rode directly to the Throckmorton estate, Coton Court, to tell a group of Catholics, including two Jesuits, of Guy Fawkes' arrest and the plan to blow up King James I in his parliament. The family were wise enough to be living abroad at the time, having rented the house out to another prominent Catholic family. Francis Tresham, cousin of Robert Catesby and the son of Sir Thomas Tresham and Muriel Throckmorton of Coton Court, joined the conspiracy late and came under suspicion of having betrayed it. The Vokes family of Northamptonshire is another example of Catholic resistance as well. And the picture of those Coton Court there. The Vokes family of Northamptonshire is an example of Catholic resistance to Elizabeth I's laws regarding the faith. The arrival in England in the summer of 1580 of the Jesuit priest Edmund Campion, formerly tutor to Lord Vokes's son Henry and Robert Persons, priest and polemicist, was seen as a spearhead of a treasonous sect seeking to inspire attempts to overthrow Elizabeth. The government's response was sympathetic, was systematic and unrelenting. Anyone who harboured or aided the Jesuits was now liable to loss of goods and life imprisonment. Lord Vokes's decision to shelter Campion was to change his life completely and have severe consequences for him and his family. Hitherto noble privilege had exempted Vokes from the oath of supremacy and allowed him to worship in his private chapel. Now all that was to change. In 1581, Vokes, a man who was said to value his good name above any treasure, was accused of recusancy. It marked a period of increasing suspicion and investigation for the family. Vokes was examined by one of his neighbours, Sir Walter Mildmay, to determine his beliefs, worship and connections with Campion and other seminary priests. He was subsequently imprisoned and spent many months in the Fleet prison for refusing to cooperate. That William Cecil Lord Burleigh, the advisor and chief minister to the Crown, drafted the letter by Vokes to the Queen which secured his release. It hints at the conflicting loyalties of the age. In March 1585, an act was passed that made it a capital offence for Jesuits and seminary priests to be in England, and yet, as the threat of prosecution grew, several of Vokes's children became active in support of the outlawed priests. Eleanor and Anne, his two eldest daughters, were seen as crucial to the success of the Catholic mission. The picture there is of Lady Vokes, who was mother of Anne, 1535. Eleanor and Anne, his two eldest daughters, were seen as crucial. Even when left a widow with two young children, Eleanor, at great danger to herself and her loved ones, sheltered Catholic priests in her home at East Ham in Essex. Her unmarried sister Anne devoted her life to establishing safe houses for priests and providing them with financial assistance. Her devotion to Henry Garnet, the Jesuit superior in England, and the risks she took for him even prompted a few questions as to the nature of their relationship. For younger sons such as Ambrose, who would traditionally have been destined for the church or the law, refusal to take the oath of supremacy barred them from graduating from university, taking up arms for the Queen, or working for the state. Ambrose, never out of debt, spent his life in and out of prison, and his younger sister Merrill eloped with a servant. Such reckless behaviour could be said to be as a result of the repressive times that they were living through. Some of the authorities must have seen the influence of recusant mothers, daughters and widows as an immediate danger to the Anglican Church, Anglican hold on society, because of recusant women's ability to convert members of the established church and give strength to other Catholics. By word and deed, recusant women must have represented those who not only refused to abandon the old faith, but actively participated in Catholic consolidation and evangelization. Thus, they were a threat to the state, and Sir Francis Walsingham's spy network was charged with monitoring and reporting on their activities. Catholic families could trust only a small number of relatives and retainers, as informers were suspected within every household. Priests could be hidden in priest hides when needed. They might pass for gardeners, travelling salesmen, tutors, or any disguise and persona that they could assume. The Catholic Church was also forced to acknowledge female independence in cases of Catholic wives of Protestant husbands. But for this to occur, women had to be encouraged to act independently and confidently without the aid of a priest or male counterpart. Due to this, some Catholic women were forced by their conscience to go behind the back of their non-Catholic menfolk, be they fathers, uncles, husbands, sons, or cousins. Independence of mind and conscience gave some of these women a role they hitherto had not had. The tactics and subterfuges some of them developed in the late 1570s became increasingly necessary as government pressure increased. Loyalties were divided between faith, family, and crown. Recusant women often engaged in needlework and the embroidery of vestments as a way of covertly practicing the Catholic faith. Many vestments, such as chasubles, stoles, and copes, were seized by the authorities in their raids on recusant country houses. Childs, a 2014 book, asserts that in households such as Anne and Eleanor Vokes's, pious ladies were supposed to work the needle in sober, straight-back devotion. Catholic ladies were expected to spend hours in reflective and meditative needlework, creating both everyday items such as bed coverings, but also vestments for visiting priests. The making of vestments by the families of recusant women was done as a form of Jesuit-led meditation upon the Virgin Mary and served both to replace confiscated items, secure the family wealth through embroidery of high-value jewels, and to establish tight connections with Catholic seminaries. Needlework was used as visual rhetoric and as a vehicle through which elite women participated in patronage networks and consolidated their political relations, facilitating their political agency in a female political hierarchy hidden from wider society within which they could not engage. Eleanor and Anne Vokes were two sisters who did everything they could to aid the Jesuit priests they served. Both were intelligent, resourceful, and determined. Eleanor was a widow and was unmarried. Anne Vokes was born in 1562 to parents William, 3rd Baron Vokes of Harrowden, Northamptonshire. It's a picture there of Harrowden House as it is now. It is now a golf club, and on the right is a picture of Anne Vokes from a BBC TV programme. They were related to Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife. The family hid Edmund Campion, and he educated Anne Vokes. Vokes was fined a huge sum for his part in hiding this priest, and Tresham and Catesby were also fined after the arrest, torture, and execution of Edmund Campion in 1581. They were also imprisoned. 5 years after Campion's execution, it was reported that certain pieces of Campion found their way into the Vokes household. Anne Vokes helped the Catholic cause after taking over from her brother, who died in prison. Taking on this role, Anne worked with her sister Eleanor to support Jesuit priests by renting houses they could use as safe houses. Some secular Catholic clergy disliked the closeness between Catholic women and Jesuit priests. One such was William Watson, who launched a vicious attack on such women. Interclerical rivalry and disagreement was, to a certain extent, an issue during this time. Watson criticised Mistress A.V., as he called her, as a seeming saintly votary. Some secular clergy criticised the strict views of the Jesuits, their Spanish origins, and their love of learning. They were also sometimes accused by secular priests of having flamboyant dress sense. Likewise, some Jesuits regarded secular clergy of being somewhat lazy, eager to compromise, and unable to convert local people, let alone minister to the needs of Catholic families. It was during this time that Anne Vokes met a Jesuit priest called Father Henry Garnet, who was later executed for his part in the Gunpowder Plot. She was suspected of sending an anonymous letter with her relative, Francis Tresham, to William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle, warning him to avoid Parliament on November 5th, 1605. It's believed by some this letter was instrumental in foiling the plot. There is no way of proving that, of course. It's simply a supposition, but it's a possibility that she actually wrote the letter at the time. She was arrested soon after the plot was discovered, but always claimed not to play a direct role in it. She did admit to suspecting it would happen, though. After her release, she tried to hide Garnet in the home of Thomas Abington in Hindlip, Worcestershire. They hid priests and rented properties so that they could move the priests between the properties, as spies were everywhere. Anne was dedicated to Father Henry Garnet and often travelled with him around the country. Twice a year, they would host Jesuit conferences where vows were renewed and promises were made. Garnet and other Jesuits had enormous support from the Vokes sisters, as well as other wives, widows and spinsters. The work of God is being pressed forward often enough by delicate women who have taken on the courage of men. Anne spent about 20 years looking after Henry Garnet, dedicating herself to keeping Catholicism alive. She begged Father Garnet to stop her cousin, William Catesby, from going ahead with the plan, knowing Garnet would suffer the consequences. Anne wrote letters written in orange juice and given to Garnet's jailer, but she was later arrested and interrogated over a part in the plot. Interrogators accused Anne of impropriety with Garnet. So there's a quote here as well from a document in Nottingham University Library about her as well. She called herself Mrs. Smith or Mistress Smith, and the authorities knew something was going on, but they didn't know quite what or who was involved. So they really didn't know enough information to arrest her or other people at times. The information was often patchy and not always correct. When she was arrested, she reportedly laughed out loud and replied, "You come to me with this child's play and impertinence, a sign that you have nothing of importance with which to charge me." She denied treason, but admitted to having conspirators at her houses, but was not convicted of recusancy until many years later in 1625. Here's some examples of some documents. This is a presentment bill basically to concerned with arresting her. This was from 1614. The authorities were onto her, but they didn't always manage to pin anything on her. And there's another document as well, another presentment bill from 1614, naming her as well. This is a picture of Anne Vokes from the BBC series Gunpowder, and so this is how the BBC imagined her to be. We've no idea what she really looked like, but it's a possible likeness anyway. And here's the quote that she showed. That she's supposed to have quote she's supposed to have said when she was arrested. She didn't show any fear of interrogators at all. Eleanor Brooksby was another English noblewoman who, along with her sister Anne Vokes, supported Catholics in England during the 16th century, and provided safe houses including Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire and Whitewebs in Enfield Chase near London for Jesuit missionaries such as Henry Garnet. There is so much the Vokes family contributed to the Catholic cause at this time. External pressures to conform forced Catholics to adapt to preserve their faith. Priestly ministry, children's education, inheritance, wardship, political and financial difficulties, and familial issues were all further complicated during government attempts to enforce conformity. Catholic women, both recusant or church papist, were central to this adaptation to changing circumstances, and thus the preservation of the ember of Catholic faith among the Catholic community in England at that time. Recusant women certainly had essential communal and devotional roles in the Catholic community at this time. The exercise of these roles drew the attention of the authorities, but also allowed the women to play an integral part in keeping the community alive through the harbouring of priests, collecting and passing money, holding masses within their homes, passing on Catholic literature and devotion. It's just a few examples of what went on. Recusant women provided what was necessary to keep different recusant families close together and to allow them to support each other. In addition, recusant families, recusant women and mothers, were instruments in converting other members of the community. The bravery, determination, and sheer inventiveness of Catholic women made an outstanding contribution to the ember of Catholicism in England. Here's a quote, "Goodness in this tragic episode belongs to the priests and lay brothers such as Nicholas Owen and the heroic women," from Fraser, Fraser's book on this subject. Through fearless efforts, these women helped ensure that recusancy endured and made it possible for a new generation of English Catholics to come of age. Certainly, their contribution was just as vital in maintaining the Catholic faith as was the work of their husbands, brothers, fathers, and friends. Fraser, in his book in 1996, whilst considering the tragedy of the Gunpowder Plot, concludes that the goodness of this tragic episode belongs to the priests and lay brothers such as Nicholas Owen and these heroic women. Women could not tramp the lanes or be guides or bodyguards for priests, but what they could do was to make a distinct contribution. But what women could do was to achieve the same purposes by ways more acceptable to the sensitivities of their contemporaries. And the most important and most valuable thing they could do was to stay at home within their own recognized sphere of domestic responsibility, and there make adequate provision for the reception and safety of the priest visitors delivered to them by the men. Roland Connolly, Women of the Catholic Resistance, says it could be argued that Catholic recusant women's families and social relationships, as well as their determination not to be coerced by the patriarchal society they found themselves in, or even in some cases their own husbands and fathers, must have aided the survival of Catholicism in both towns and rural areas. Without their courage, stoicism, obstinacy, and grim determination, let alone their unwavering faith in God, Catholicism may have been virtually extinguished in England during the 16th century. Recusant women provided the necessary social glue to keep different recusant families close together and to allow them to support each other. The sacrifice Catholic mothers made in sending their sons and daughters away to the continent to become priests or nuns cannot be underestimated either. Some whose priests returned to England to minister to the faithful, some such as George Napier from Oxford and the many martyrs celebrated by the church today, travelled the roads visiting sick and the elderly and bringing the sacraments to faithful Catholics. Risking their lives daily, they played cat and mouse with the authorities, and by hiding priests and priest hides in the houses of the local gentry, they defied the laws prohibiting the celebration of Mass and Catholic sacraments. Catholic women were clearly central to the enterprise and must have cooperated with others to achieve their goals. The many priest hides which have survived, such as those at Harvington Hall, near Kidderminster, are testament enough to the courage and ingenuity of these Catholic families. In addition, several recusant women were instruments in both conversion and apologetics. Certainly their contribution was just as vital in maintaining the Catholic faith as was the work of their husbands, brothers, fathers, and friends. Lady Arundel, for example, there we are, Lady Arundel, Margaret Clitherow, Lady Constable, Margaret Dormer, Anne Lyne, Elizabeth Fisher, Viscountess Montague, Margaret Pole, Catherine Radcliffe, Cicely Stoner, Anne Tetch, Margaret Roper, Margaret Throckmorton, Dorothy Wiseman, Anne Vokes, Eleanor Vokes, Elizabeth Vokes, Dorothy Vavasor, and many, many more. So it's to them that we owe an enormous amount for the continuation of the faith. So I hope that's been interesting this evening, and I hope you've learnt a few things about the faith in these troubled times after the Reformation. So that concludes what I'm going to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. That was a very comprehensive and fascinating tour through those troubled centuries and the heroic efforts of so many Catholic women. We had a couple of comments asking to see a bibliography. Was your final slide? Did you show a bibliography there?
Yes, certainly, yes.
Perhaps you could
It's a bit small.
Perhaps you could just leave that on display.
I can leave that up there. It's a bit small. So some of the books that I've quoted, like Aveling and Bossy, Child's book is the God's Traitors, brilliant book on the period. Connolly, Catholic Women of Catholic Resistance, and various other books. The only book that I could find that was specifically on Catholic women was this one here, which is by Connolly, Women of the Catholic Resistance. But there is no book that I can find that specifically analyzes the role of the women, Catholic women at this time. There's bits and pieces in lots of different books, but not one particular book that analyzes. Connolly lists information about all these different women, but he doesn't really analyze and discuss it at all, apart from in the introduction to it. So there's a need for a book there. Somebody needs to write one, I think, sooner or later, perhaps.
Well,
I have actually, it has actually been suggested that by Redemptorists that I write it.
Well, they beat me to it, and I was about to make the same suggestion. Well, thanks again, Tim. We've got a bit of time, I think, for question. Well, perhaps we'll try and wrap up by 9 o'clock, but
Yes.
there are some questions in the chat. I guess you can see the chat as well as I
Yes,
can.
I'll have a look at the
Tim,
chat.
but I'll just I'll take them more or less in the order in which they came in. And the first question, I'm not sure it's quite on the subject of Catholic women precisely, but it asks about the decision by the Pope to excommunicate. Well, you mentioned this, the decision to excommunicate Elizabeth I.
Yes.
The influence on that of the Northern Rebellion, and
Yes.
you can see the rest of the questions there. So, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that question.
Not sure where the question is in there, but anyway,
Well,
there seems to be quite a few things in there. So I'm not quite sure what they're asking, because I have to sort of skim through really there.
well, perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment.
The Northern Rebellion, yes, the Northern Rebellion was mainly in Yorkshire and the north of England, obviously, and many of the gentry joined it, and it brought repercussions on a lot of them, and that was one of the reasons why there were restrictions and laws passed against Catholics, was because of the Northern Rebellion. The Pope was cyclical as well.
I think the essence of the question is whether the Northern Rebellion and the deaths which followed it influenced the Pope in deciding to excommunicate Queen Elizabeth, or were there other reasons?
I think there were wider factors than that. I think that may have been one of the influences, one of the reasons. But it was probably pressure from Spain that was more likely to be the reason for that. The Spanish court had an awful lot of influence on what happened to the Vatican, and I think it was, from what I can read, it was more the influence of the Spanish saying, this Queen Elizabeth is an imposter and a heretic, do something about it. And they egged the Pope on to do it. And it was a disaster for Catholics. It was an absolute disaster for local Catholic people in England. It brought terrible repercussions.
Yes.
So I'd say it's more the influence of the Spanish court. Which
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And we have another. This is. I don't think you could be expected to quite answer this question exactly. How do we know? You showed a slide of the hand of St. Margaret Clitherow.
Yes.
How do we know it's the hand of St. Margaret Clitherow?
That's a very good question.
Was it kept by relatives and DNA tested?
Yes. There is, yes. In answer to that, after she died, she was executed. They threw her body on a dung heap somewhere in the town. They wouldn't tell her family where it was. It took them, I think, about 2 weeks to find where the body was. And under cover of darkness, they took her body away. They took it to an unknown destination. It is recorded, I can't remember who by, that her hand was cut off and kept preserved in York, or in some other place, but probably in York. The body there's two possible places for her burial. One is at Osmotherley, at the chapel there, Chapel of Our Lady at Osmotherley, and the other is at a chapel, which is actually an Anglican chapel in northern Lancashire, because there was a Lancashire connection. Both places lay claim to it, but nobody knows for certain where her body was laid. But her hand was preserved. Well, we are told her hand was preserved. It's in the Bar Convent in York, and I'd imagine if somebody looked up about the Bar Convent in York, it might have more information on that, about the provenance of it, about the story behind that.
Yes, and then someone has commented. Well, Jean Michel Datiles has commented that she's provided a link to a website about Recusant family trees and relatives networks. I'd like to thank her for that, and also thank her for introducing me to the word prosopography, which appears on that website, prosopographical, which apparently means a person's social and family connection. So thank you for enlarging our vocabulary as well. I've also learned during this talk, I've been reminded at least of the difference between Mary Ward and Margaret Ward, which I must say had escaped me at times. So thank you for reminding me of that. And then there's a very good question here. Why are there only 4 women recognized from this time as saints or martyrs by the church, when clearly hundreds were involved in protecting Catholic priests and protecting the Catholic faith in England?
That's an interesting question. Perhaps that question should be addressed to the bishops of England and Wales. Actually, they maybe could consider that and put that to the Vatican. There seems to be a bias in favor of men, obviously. Obviously, many of them were priests. I mean, around 200 priests were executed during the reign of Elizabeth or soon after. And but there were many, as we said, many of these women were executed, often for treason. which was a capital offence. And of course, it's still on the statute books today, in fact. But there isn't so much information about them. Some of them were very ordinary women, and not much was written down at a time when a lot of people weren't very literate. And a lot of these women were very ordinary. There probably wasn't very much written about them. Although if you search the records, there would no doubt be records to do with their imprisonment or execution. They will be somewhere or other. But yes, in my opinion, there should be more recognition of these women. Whether any should become blessed or canonized as saints, I don't know. But it'd be an interesting question to ask the bishops of England and Wales, perhaps, or someone else. But I think it's certainly my quest is to actually to raise the profile of these women, to remind people about their sacrifice and how saintly and brave and courageous and inventive these ladies really were.
We've got, before we get to the final question, I had a little question of my own, and apologies if it's a bit of a gruesome one, but I was reading about Margaret Ward being hanged at Tyburn. I don't know if you know whether there's a difference between the punishment for men and women in terms of treason. That you often hear about men being hanged, drawn and quartered.
Women weren't hanged, drawn and quartered, because hanged, drawn and quartered was entirely for men. I won't go into the details of what they did to men, but it wasn't pleasant, shall we say. People could find information elsewhere. But women were sometimes hanged and then their heads removed, basically, and put on a spike. So that happened with some Catholic women who were charged with treason. They'd be hanged, presumably till they were dead, I presume, and then their heads cut off. Whereas with hang, drawing and quarter, they were not fully dead, the men, and other things were done to them. So yes, there was a different punishment for men and women for treason. It might seem strange, but that's the way it was.
Indeed, I remember being at school and being read the story of Campion.
Yes.
In Evelyn Waugh's biography, they say his body was taken down and the butcher then began his work.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, the final question I have here on the chat is from Christopher Lee, and he says, are there any examples of women or mothers who fled to the continent or colonies with their children or family without their husbands? Any related court records, etc., whether or not the husband was non-Catholic or perhaps cooperative with the mother, though publicly conforming?
I expect there are. I don't actually know a whole lot about that, but I expect there are. Obviously, many sons went abroad for education, both sort of schooling and seminary. Some women went abroad to become nuns and be educated in convents. Some men went abroad to avoid being arrested by the authorities, went to the Low Countries or to other countries in Europe to live out their lives, either permanently or temporarily. I don't know enough about whole families moving to the continent, though. I'm sure there must have been. There absolutely must have been. I mean, after all, during the reign of Mary, there were many Protestants who moved to the continent, and then vice versa. When Elizabeth came to the throne, some Catholics immediately moved to the continent so they could be free to worship and pray as they wished. So there was a movement of people. There was considerably more movement of people than some imagine at that time. People could come and go. There was trade going on. People did travel abroad. They had to have reasons to travel abroad, because after all, there were restrictions. I mean, under Elizabeth, Catholics weren't allowed to travel more than 5 miles from their home without a good reason. And they had to apply to a magistrate for a good reason, such as trade or moving to their estate somewhere else or moving abroad. And if they were moving abroad, they were immediately under suspicion as to why they were moving abroad. They could be questioned either on the way abroad or coming back. And some of the Jesuits, when they came back, were questioned for a long time about who they were, what they were doing, and that sort of thing, because they had assumed identities and that type of thing. There was a lot of suspicion, but people were allowed to move. People did move to the continent at times. So hopefully that's about as much information as I can say at the moment, anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Well, that leaves me with just 3 final tasks. The first task is to thank you again, Tim, for that masterful and fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And to thank you particularly because I don't think people won't realise that you are in fact suffering from COVID at the moment.
Yes.
But you have persevered through that to give us our very interesting talk for this evening. So thank you again, Tim, for your
Hoping at some
preparation.
point to actually publish an article on this. So what I've used for the talk is amounts to about 10,000 words.
Well, I'd say it's crying out for an article, so we look forward to reading it.
Yeah.
The second thing is just to draw your attention to the future events. I've put them on the chat. We've got future ECHA talks on the 7th of March on women religious as peace builders, the 4th of April about Catherine of Aragon, and the 6th of June about Catherine of Braganza. So we have a lot of talks about women in the first half of this year. I'm not sure if that's deliberate, but that's excellent. Please do look at our website, echa.org.uk, and please consider joining us for the talks and also joining the association. It's only £11 a year, marvellous value, and we do need your support. So please consider that.
There's an AGM, of course, later on in the year, isn't there, which people are welcome to go to.
Yes, there will be, indeed.
Last one was in was the end of October, I think, in Westminster.
That's right. We had an excellent talk in person from Adrian Waddingham about Nicholas Breakspear, the so far only English Pope. Anyway, my final task is to thank you all again for attending tonight. I hope you've enjoyed. I can see from the comments that many of you have been kind enough to say how much you've enjoyed this evening's talk. Thanks again for attending. Good night and God bless. Thank you. Good night.